Okay, so let's review a little bit about what happened in chapter 1, right? We want to do that first. And we're thinking about Mr. Utterson and his cousin, Mr. Enfield. Remember? They were taking a walk and they came across what did they come across that made Mr. Enfield remember a story? What was it, Dalton? The door, okay? They passed by this blistered door. And Enfield told Utterson this very unsettling story about this man who trampled a little girl. And we found out that the name of the man was what? Mr. Hyde. So chapter 2, remember, we're trying to solve this mystery. Chapter 2 is now about the search for Mr. Hyde. I need everybody to sit up tall while you're reading, okay? We don't want to hold our bodies up with our elbows or our fists. We want to keep our back straight while we're reading because that'll help us stay focused on what we're doing. Chapter 2, the search for Mr. Hyde. Make it a little bit. Nope, I don't guess so. I'm just going to try to make it larger. Try to go up here. There we go. Okay. That evening, Mr. Utterson took up a candle and went into his business room. Now remember, this is the 1800s. They don't have light switches. He can't just go into the office and turn on his light. He has to light a candle because there is no electricity. Okay? So he took a candle and he went to his business room, which we usually call an office. There, he opened his safe, took from it the most private part, a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will. And he sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. Now we're talking about Mr. Utterson. Remember, he's a lawyer, right? And he's going into his safe in the middle of the night, and he pulls out a document, Dr. Jekyll's will. Now, what is a will?
Is it like if you die, these things happen?
Yes. It's when you pass, or when your relatives pass, they have a list of things that they are going to pass down to different people. And they name it in the will. Who gets this and who's going to get that. And they divide up their property and their money, any kind of assets that they have in a will. Okay. I also want to draw your attention to the first paragraph where it says, he sat down with a clouded brow. This is your brow, right? Your eyebrows, that's your brow. If his brow is clouded, how are we describing him there? If he's clouded, if he's kind of mad, kind of confused. If you're in a cloud, sometimes you can't see, right? Because it's foggy. You can't see, you're confused, or you're perplexed. Something's eating away at you, and you want to find some answers. So you're curious. You're trying to find an answer. So he gets the will out, and he's looking at it. Let's look at the next paragraph. The will was holograph, for Mr. Utterson had refused to lend assistance in the making of it. So the will was a copy, because Mr. Utterson was not involved in making the original document. So he received a copy of it. That's what holograph means. It provided that in case of the deceased, that's the dead person, right? Or the disappearance or the unexplained absence of Dr. Henry Jekyll, MD, all of his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor Edward Hyde. Mr. Hyde, the man that trampled the little girl. Okay? So, you can imagine, I bet Mr. Utterson thought when he heard the name Hyde previously, when Enfield was telling the story, he said, I think the man's name is Hyde. He probably thought, Hyde? That name sounds familiar. I wonder if that's the same Hyde. Let me go check the will and look at the will. So, Dr. Jekyll is saying in his will that he's leaving everything he has to this Mr. Hyde. Interesting. Let me pull it down a little bit, if I can. And with all that, after learning that, he blew out his candle, put on a greatcoat, his overcoat, and he set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine, where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house, and he received his crowding patients. So Dr. Lanyon is a new patient, or a new character, and Mr. Utterson is headed to his house. Now, back in London, back in the 1800s, they didn't have a doctor's office like in the downtown area. These doctors would actually practice medicine at their house. So if you needed to go to the doctor, you went to their house. And oftentimes they would have like a laboratory area where you would go to in their house. Okay? So he headed over to Dr. Lanyon's, and let's see what it says about him. The hardy, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman at the side of Mr. Utterson sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. This is Dr. Lanyon. You see how they've described him here? He's hardy. I think he might be a little bit overweight, maybe. Hardy, healthy. Dapper means he dresses well. He's a red-faced gentleman. Okay? I suppose, Lanyon, said he, you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has. We were, was the reply. But it's been more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. Such unscientific balderdash, said the doctor. So he says, don't we know Henry Jekyll really well? We're probably two guys that know Henry Jekyll better than anybody else. Isn't that right? And Lanyon says, well, not so much me. It's been 10 years. He said, I don't have anything to do with Henry Jekyll anymore. Okay? So you might wonder why. Then it says, did you ever come across a protege of his, this one Hyde? He asked. No, never heard of him. I'm reading right now. Never heard of Mr. Hyde. So don't you think it's odd that Dr. Lanyon hasn't heard of him? He must be an important person to Henry Jekyll if Henry Jekyll is going to give him everything on his will. That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed on which he now tossed to and fro until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. He's worried. He doesn't know why Dr. Jekyll would give his money to a man who is low enough to want to trample and hurt a child. It's not making sense to Mr. Utterson. Okay. And it's eating away at him. He wants to know why. Why would Jekyll want to associate with a crazy man like Edward Hyde? Okay. So he goes home and he can't sleep. Let's see what happens next. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door of the by street. He went back to that blistered door. Okay. If he be Mr. Hyde, he thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. How do you like that play on words? Hide and seek. And at last, His patience was rewarded. The man was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think. I'm an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's. I thought you might admit me," meaning, I thought you might let me into your house, because I'm a friend of your friend, Henry Jekyll. "You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He is from home," replied Mr. Hyde. "But it is as well we have met, and you should have my address." And he gave a number of a street in Soho. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. So he kind of looked deformed, but you couldn't really tell, okay, he has Down syndrome, or okay, he has cleft palate, or okay, he has a club foot. You couldn't really identify what his malformation was. You just knew he looked a little bit off. He looked deformed, okay? He had a displeasing smile, but these could not explain the disgust, the loathing, and the fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. Okay. The other, Mr. Hyde, snarled aloud in a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. Round the corner, there was a square of ancient, handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate and let in flats and chambers. One house, however, was still occupied entire, and at the door of this, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. A well-dressed elderly servant opened the door. Let's see where he is. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "Dr. Jekyll," said Poole, "has gone out." "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting room door, Poole," he said. "Is that right, when Jekyll is from home?" I mean, he's saying, is that normal for Mr. Hyde to go into Dr. Jekyll's laboratory when Dr. Jekyll is not home? "Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir," replied the servant. "Mr. Hyde has a key. We all have orders to obey him. Good night, Mr. Utterson." And the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. Poor Harry Jekyll, he thought. He is in deep waters. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. So let's think about this for a minute. Mr. Utterson, sit up. Mr. Utterson is worried about Dr. Jekyll, okay? Because not only has he willed all of his money to the man, he's allowing him to come and go out of his house. So apparently we know now the blistered door is the back door to Dr. Jekyll's laboratory. Okay, we have found that much out. Because he says, "Why is Mr. Hyde going in the back door of the lab?" Okay, so now we know where the blistered door goes. And we know Dr. Jekyll never uses that door. He always probably goes in his front door. But the thing that bothers Utterson is that why are the servants, why have they been told to obey Mr. Hyde? Why would they? There's so many unanswered questions on this chapter. But there ends the reading of chapter 2.